Have a great day, everyone. We are now on the fourth module, and this is still Philippine literature under the Academia Gonzaga Learning Systems. At this moment, we will be tackling American and Japanese era in Philippine literature. I also titled this one as the Am-Jap era in Philippine literature. Before going further, let me give you a bird's eye view of what we will study here. Aside from Spanish colonizers, the Americans and the Japanese are the two other colonizers that is very prominent in history to have occupied Philippines. Now, as of this moment, you know that America is the second shortest, and the Japanese regime is also the shortest. However, these two has the most effect in our literature because the Americans played so much with our emotional concept, while the Japanese physically abused the Filipinos, and that is no secret in our history. Now let us continue. Let us first tackle American-Philippine literature, meaning these are the Philippine literary outputs in the American era of colonizing Philippines. Now in 1898, the Americans were able to grab the Philippines from the Spaniards after 333 years. Well, June 12 was the date of that independence wherein the Filipinos supposed to be will have their own freedom already, but the Americans fooled them because the Americans just wanted their allegiance to transfer to the Americans and not to the Spaniards. And there was really no independence during those moments. Now, there are many things that transpired. Actually, what started the war, is the incident at the Pinaglabanan Bridge wherein an American soldier gunned down a Filipino soldier just crossing the bridge. So this created outrage between Filipinos and Americans, which started the war. Now, during these times, Filipino writers already divided into three groups. We have three groups of writers already. We have the Filipino writers, okay, those who write in Filipino or in the native language. The Filipino writers in Spanish, those who write in the Spanish language. And then the Filipino English writers, those who write in English. Of course, you have a mixed group, but they are informal and they are not really recognized because during those times, if you write Filipino, you'll be credited as a Filipino writer in a certain era. Then you write Spanish or you write English, but no mixed writing, which is very familiar today. Now, Americans are not very strict with output, not just like the Spaniards wherein Filipinos are asked to write, and then at the end of the day, it is the Spanish checker that gets the credit because they changed the authorship. But the Americans, they respected the rightful authors, meaning they know how to give byline credits during these times. So starting this time, Filipinos enjoyed already being appreciated for what they write because the Americans are not credit grabbers actually. So whoever wrote that one, they are really given the honor of being the writers of this literature. Now, the writers in Filipino lamented the condition of the country in their outputs, and they again attempted to fight oppression because as what I've told you earlier, the Americans they promised the Filipinos that they will give complete independence, but they fooled us because they want also to colonize us. So the Filipino writers tried to reflect everything. Their literary sentiments focused on how they want reformation, how they want renaissance, how they want renovation. They want change. In 1920, the UP College, Folio, a newspaper arm of the educated Filipinos, was replaced and stabilized by the main newspaper of the anti-American Filipino called the Philippine Collegian. Now, let us not also forget that the Americans were the ones who introduced the newspaper literature to the Philippines. It was during the American era where people are being informed not by mouth already, not by the bells of the church, not by the messages of the church, of the priest, but this time formally by spreading papers to houses, papers to institutions, because this is the new way of information dissemination through literature, and this is called the newspaper. Now let us focus on the American literature in the period wherein they occupied the Philippines. So I title this as the periods of American literature. There are actually three periods in American literature. You have the period of Reorientation, the second is the period of imitation, and the last is the period of self-discovery. So let us go first to the period of reorientation, I mean. English as a literary vehicle came from the American occupation, and English became the suggested medium of instruction in school. Now, if you come to think of this, there is another adjustment as to the learning system because we start with the Alibata. Then we go with the Malayo-Polynesian. These are the pre-colonial languages that we use. Then we shift to the Spaniards, and now we use English. So there is really an adjustment period. There is a need to reorient the people of why we are transferring to another language. So this is the period of reorientation. This period aims to acclimatize. When I say acclimatize, to let every Filipino go and immerse into the English language. Okay? But if you come to think of it, there is still the adjustment. So in the period of reorientation, the literatures of the Filipinos are still in Spanish and in the native language. There is still no production of English literature here because they are still reoriented, meaning they have to learn again. They have to go to school again. They have to be knowledgeable again. So, let me be clear with this. In the period of reorientation, there is still the struggle of letting English be introduced to the Filipinos. But the literatures during this time are still in Spanish, okay, and in the native languages. The second period is the period of imitation. In the period of imitation, this is the state wherein we cannot yet fully make a full English literature, but we can already finish a whole literature, but it has still a combination of Spanish, Filipino, and English languages in it. Now, because of the struggle to immerse ourselves and use the new language of the new colonizers, okay, we cannot perfect the English language, so we use all kinds of language, and you can just imagine the kind of output that we have during this era. Okay? Sak-sak sinagol, or shall we say, halo-halo. You have a literature wherein there are Spanish words, Filipino words, English words, but still because of the artistry of the Filipinos, we come up with quality literatures. Very notable and very good ones. Now, it was also during this time when we tried to imitate ideas and thoughts from American literature and just revise it to come up with Filipino versions. Well, just like an elementary student, when we start to learn something, we don't really become experts right away. We start with copying, imitating, okay, patterning, and later on, doing our own. So in the period of imitation, it's normal that we first refer to American literatures, we try to copy some of them, innovate some of them, paraphrase some of them, and then we are trying to hone up our skills in English. This is actually a period of identity crisis wherein Filipinos don't certainly know what their literature is. Are we writing full Spanish, full English, full Filipino? What are we writing? This is a period of confusion, but a period that will certainly enrich Philippine literature. The last period here is the period of self-discovery. This is the period of mastery in the use of English language and usage of English in the literature. So during this time, no more imitation. We make our own literatures already. No more copying. We can already speak fluent English. We can master the language. We are now talking like the Americans. And our output, I really like that, of English people and American people. So, we have reached already the highest point of English as a language in our literature. That is now the period of self-discovery. Now, this is the real time when Filipinos embrace English as the principal literary output language over Spanish and Filipino. My, it's nostalgic that we have to leave Spanish and Filipino literature. Those are also very nice and very cool literatures. However, it should not be mistaken that there are still other Filipinos who continuously write Filipino and Spanish if there is time because the Americans are not stopping them or not implementing strictness in writing only English literatures. They can write Spanish, they can write Filipinos, but the school is educating and giving prime attention to English literatures. That's why many literatures shifted to English. Now, if you come to think of it, every literary era has their own topics, okay? Or things that they want to talk about in their literature. In the American colonization of the Philippines, the literature talks about love of country, longing for independence, hatred for oppressors. If you come to think of it, these three topics, again, love of country, longing for independence, hatred for oppressors, this calls for change. This calls for complete independence. This calls for total and absolute freedom. Filipinos already know that we are fooled. Filipinos are tired of being manhandled by other sovereign, other countries. That's why they wanted to talk about change, to talk about reformation. And their topics would be love of country, longing for independence, hatred for oppressors. So find any American literature and you will know that these are actually their topics. Now, there are three kinds of literatures in the Philippine colonization of the Americans. Okay, the literature, this time it's not the literature, I'm sorry. There are three kinds of literatures, meaning these are people who write literature. There are literatures of the heart. Usually they talk about love, hate, and other feelings of impressions and expressions. We have also the literatures of life. Usually they talk about works, experiences, lessons, and wishes in life. Then we have the literatures of the stage. Usually they are not writers, but they are the ones giving life to the stories from the heart and that of the life, meaning they act on stage, they dramatize on stage. So to review, there are actually three types of literatures in the American colonization of the Philippines. Okay, we have the literatures by heart. The person wants to talk about love. The literatures of life, the persons who want to talk about experiences. And then the literatures of the stage, the persons who put into life by acting and dramatizing the literatures of the heart and the literatures of life. Now, what are the literature types in the Philippine colonization of the Americans, or in the era of the American colonization in the Philippines? I'm sorry to get confused by that. First, as I have mentioned earlier, you have newspapers and newsletters. They introduced that to us. So the common examples, we have the Philippine Collegian, founded by UP, University of the Philippines. You have also the El Nueva Dia, or in English, the New Day, founded by Sergio Osmeña. And then we have the El Renacimiento, or the Rebirth, founded by Rafael Palma. So these are the dominant newspapers during that time. We have also literatures like plays, the conversion of the Spanish duplo to the multi-conversational style. This time, not only two persons talking. And this time, there are many people acting on it, and you call that plays. And another literature introduced by the Americans to us are the congregational hymns, meaning this is a type of lyrical song or a literature in song being performed by a group of many people. This is already the kind of literature wherein people in the church sing, the congregational singing. That is also called congregational hymn, and that was introduced by the Americans in the American colonization of the Philippines. So we have great authors also in the American colonization in the Philippines. You have Lupica Santos, okay? Famous writing is Banaad and Sikat. You have Jose Corazon de Jesus, okay? The famous writing is Balitang Cavite. And then you have Amado Hernandez. The famous writing is Mga Ibong Mandaragit. So, just to give you a bird's eye view, we have 7 great literary products of the Philippine colonial American era. You have Kahapon, Ngayon at Bukas, Tanikalang Ginto, Malaya, Walang Sugat, El Nido, La Punta de Salto, Aroma de Ensueño. Okay? These are the greatest works of the Filipinos during the American era. Now let us move already to the Japanese Filipino literature. This era happened between 1941 to 1945, almost 5 years of colonization under Japan, simulated with the World War II. If you come to think of it, Japanese wanted to occupy Philippines by force. That's why everything in this era is about brutality. It's about physical strictness. It's about being harsh. Okay? Philippine literature in English came to a halt. It was formally and strictly prohibited from existence by the Japanese for the reason that it is the language of their opponent country. So very selfish reason, huh? During these times, all newspapers were written, or all newspapers were banned because newspapers were introduced by the Americans. Okay? Now, there were only 5 newspapers that were permitted to exist as a sign of goodwill and a sign of pressure to the existing newspapers. These are the Philippine Tribune, the Philippine Review, Pilars, Free Press, and the Filipina. If you come to imagine, Free Press is already a very, very old newspaper company. During the Philippine colonization of the Japanese era, there was no freedom of speech and press. That's very, very clear because they're very tyrant. That is why Victoria Abelardo okay, has described Filipino writing during this time as pessimistic, meaning very sad, very negative, and bitter. Okay? There were some efforts of the escapist literature. Say escapist literature. These are literatures of the Spaniards, Americans, the native Filipinos, who are still written in a very undisclosed area. They are hiding because they still want to write this one. But the Japanese Armada doesn't want them to write about this. So we call them escapist literature. During this era, the literatures have strict censorship. So censorship were already introduced in the Japanese era. This is the implemented system of the Japanese. If it's okay with their line of thinking, then they will permit. If not, they will garbage your literature. That's why there are many Filipinos who became a splinter group. They don't believe in this kind of journalism. That's why they formed their own group and later on contradicted with the Japanese way of making literatures, and they want to stand for their rights. But of course, they were treated with brutality also. Filipino Nationalists established a weekly newspaper during the time, and it was called BYY. It was operated by Filipinos, the language is Filipino, but the motives were buried in figurative presentation. What we're trying to see here, dear learners, is they are trying to hide their nationalistic and patriotic messages in forms of love stories, literary outputs, poetries, so that it will not be obviously discovered by the Japanese. So you can see the talent of the Filipinos during this time to creatively transport nationalistic and patriotic literature through the form of figurative love poetries and figurative work of arts. Now, the only contact with the outside world during the time is through the Japanese. So, there is really no freedom during the time, and that's very understandable. Now, literature during this era, during the Japanese era, are dramas. They have also poetry. Actually, their very famous poetry is the haiku poetry. Now, this is a poetry of 3 verses that the Japanese liked. It is made up of 17 syllables divided into 3 lines. Okay. The first line has 5, the second has 7, and the third has 5, a total of 17. It is allegorical in meaning, short and covers wide and even multi-meaning in presentation, and it has rhymes. So this is the most famous Japanese literature introduced to the Philippines. Actually, we made also a version of this, a Filipino type of haiku. We have the Tanaga poetry. It's just like a haiku, but very Filipino-inspired already. Then, another poetry that the Japanese introduced to us, the Karaniwang Anyo. This is the usual poetry with multiple stanzas and line, and it has specific patterns in written meters, and these are just products of the sentiments of the Filipinos. Well, you are right. Filipinos during the ancient times, when they do sentimental thinking, poetry is very normal to them. That's why our forefathers are really very intellectual people, very artistic people, very passionate people. So, short stories are also introduced by the Japanese. Now, we have great writers during the Japanese era. You have Clodoaldo del Mundo, the work is Bulaga. You have also Juan Cruz Balmaceda, the work is Saan Ba Kayo? And you have Salvador Lopez, the work is Katotohanan at Panloloko. So these are the works of great Filipinos during this era. Well, to conclude, let us always remember that the American and the Japanese era might just be very short in the time span that we are using in our country. But the influence of the Americans, playing with our emotions, fooling us emotionally and technically, can always be patterned or seen in the Philippine literature. Same with the Japanese. They might be the shortest in terms of colonizing period, but their treatment to the Filipinos, their abusive and physical treatment to us can be reflected in our literatures. Well, there are really a lot of pain, a lot of emotions during this era. Literature is not about writing during this time. It's about the expression of the inner emotions, the inner feelings. Well, we can surely feel that the moment we will begin reading Filipino literature in the American and Japanese era of colonization in our country. Once again, this is Mentor Noy Gonzaga. This is still Academia Gonzaga Learning System, and you are watching the Instructor's Compass. We are tackling module number 4, and that is the Am-Jap colonization in Philippine literature. Have a great moment, everyone.